Have we?
Unmuting.
Are we allowing the cameras on to be on? No one's cameras are on.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the cameras.
That might be, sorry. All right, I think we're good. All right. Well, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. My name's Dave Cronin, city engineer. I'm here alongside with city staff members Jenny O'Brien, Jake Baldwin, and Dustin Smith. We will work alongside Pat Collette, the chair, to facilitate tonight's meeting proceedings. The meeting is being recorded and broadcast live on the city's YouTube channel and public access channel 25. And during the meeting, when you're not participating, please mute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon found on the lower left-hand side of the Zoom menu next to the video icon. When you're muted, a red line will appear over the icon. Muting your microphone during the meeting will make it easier for everyone to hear. You'll just have to remember to unmute if and when you want to speak. In some cases, we may mute or unmute people as needed to minimize distractions during the meeting. Please remember to state your name and title for the benefit of those listening remotely. You can turn your video on and off by clicking on the video icon on the menu. For the purposes of this public meeting, please keep your video on when you are participating in the meeting. When you are not participating, it is okay to turn your video off. Just remember to turn your video back on when you are participating. If you are participating by phone, you can click *6 to unmute your phone. For those using Zoom, somewhere on your screen, you will see a choice to toggle between speaker and gallery view. Speaker view shows the active speaker. Gallery view tiles all the meeting participants. Individuals who registered in advance to provide public comments remotely will be called upon by name. When you are called upon, please unmute your listening device and state your name before speaking. And I will turn over the meeting to Chairperson Collette to kick things off. And I guess we'll start by doing a roll call. But Pat, you want to give everyone a welcome?
Sure. This is Pat Collette, chair of MMTC. Happy to see everyone here. And we've got, I think, a really interesting study session planned as well as regular agendas. So we'll start off here with the roll call.
This is Dave Cronin, the engineer. We're having a few technical difficulties with the audio here. I think your audio is working, Pat.
Okay.
But we're not hearing it in the room.
Oh, okay.
But give us 1 sec here.
All right.
On the audio thing, audio settings. There, audio settings. LC. Oh, chips. On speaker. Just like the quiet MMTC.
Try it now, Pat.
I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Would you like me to repeat the welcome? That you guys didn't hear it? I'll do that. This is Pat Collette, Chair MMTC, and welcome you to the September 1st meeting of MMTC with both the study session and regular agenda. But before we get started, we'll kick off with a roll call.
Right. Charlie Bryan. Gregory Critchlow.
Here, present.
Okay. Court Buffington.
Here.
Steve Evans. Carol Bowen. Nick Kuzmiak. Tom Allen. Aaron Payton. Here. Lauren Freeman. Pat Collette. and David Cronin.
This is Charlie Bryan. I'm here now.
Brian is here.
And also wanted to mention that 2 of the people on your list are not members of MMTC currently. That's Tom and Lauren. And that's
Duly noted.
Yeah, and that Steve Evans may join us a little bit later. He said he might be late.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Kill that mic, Dave. There's a mic on your screen. Hit the mute button. Or one of us in this room has a mic open. Okay, try again. Okay, one more time, Dave.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right. We're going to go into the study session now. And let me raise this thing. Might be a little easier. All right. Hopefully you can see that. Attached a few slides to tonight's study session meeting. We're going to talk about crossing improvements in design standards. And that's certainly a topic that we could speak spend a lot of time talking about, but I'm going to try to give a high level overview of some of our design standards, some ongoing work regarding crossing improvements, and then maybe discuss some opportunities that are coming up with our planning processes to see if we can identify any areas or gaps to review some of our standards. So I wanted to kind of give a really high level overview of some of the standards that we use. I've kind of attached here a link to our technical resources website, which has information regarding what we require for the preparation of public improvement plans and design criteria, as well as standard details and our construction specifications, which all kind of tie into public improvement work. So in our design guide, we reference a number of design guides. I'm going to talk about a few of them that we use more often, I guess, these first 4 here with the Green Book, the Ashto Green Book, the MUTCD, and NACTO. But there's several others that from time to time we reference. And I've kind of listed those here on the screen. I'm not going to go through them all individually, but you can see there's a number of different resources that we use. I would point out ProWag is one that we follow for ADA requirements in the right of way. So that is one that we frequently reference for improvements in the right of way regarding ADA. But overall, there's a lot of guides out there that we use when we're developing public improvement plans, particularly related to transportation. And I'm going to kind of give a kind of high level overview of a few of the ones that we use pretty frequently. So the Ashto Green Book, it's published by the FHWA. Really, it's the kind of the more technical engineering design guide for design of roadways. So whether it's a city street or a highway, it's really based off of the classification of the street, the type of the facility, the design speed of the road, and it incorporates all sorts of public roads, whether it's a highway, rural road, or urban road. Also, it discusses design criteria behind intersections and interchanges. this originally, this guide was really developed around moving vehicles and design of roadways for vehicles, and not as much for multimodal facilities. Throughout the years, there's been progress from Ashto on bike ped design guides. They actually have published a separate bike ped design guide outside of what we call the Green Book. But it kind of speaks to more of design of bike ped facilities. So there's that guide is also included in our list of design guides. But that's one that is it's really technical based, and probably not one that we want to really dive into with this group tonight. But one of the design guides that we do use a lot is the NACTO, and I know we've kind of had some discussions about this previously. But there are several design guides that NACTO puts out, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. So it's a much newer guideline or document than the Ashto Green Book. But this guide, they have several different guides. The Urban Street Design Guide, which speaks to different design elements of streets, speed control, which is like traffic calming devices, whether it's a speed hump, raised crosswalk, chicanes, as well as intersection design. And this is a guide that we've used a few times in Lawrence, related to like curb bulb outs like we have downtown, and raised crosswalks. And so there's good examples in that guide that we use. Also, they published the Bikeway Design Guide, which is really focused on bicycle facilities, bike lanes, cycle tracks, intersection treatments, speaks to signings and markings for best practices and things to consider with those, and bike boulevards. So we've used this several times in Lawrence, and we're looking at intersections like 21st and Mass that has the bicycle crossing with the green pavement marking and the hawk signal. It's a good example of a project that used guidance from this document. Naismith and Crescent is another good location for another good example of an intersection treatment that was done to restrict vehicles, but still allow bicycles and pedestrians to make all movements. And of course, we've done some work on Mass Street from 11th to 14th with a green pavement marking and a bike box. So those are some examples of design criteria that we've used from that guide. They also publish a transit street design guide. I don't think we've used that, but we are looking into that, the ability to use that more as we improve some of these transit stops around the community. So I know Adam Weigel in our transit office is interested in progressing some of the improvements at bus stops, and there's good guidance in that design guide on separating interaction with pedestrians getting on and off buses versus with bicycle facilities. So there might be some opportunities as we go forward to start using some ideas in that guide. Does anyone, before I keep going, does anyone have any questions? If anyone has any specific questions and want to have an interactive discussion, I'm certainly willing to stop and address those, or we can keep going and get them at the end. So if I don't hear anything, we'll just keep going. But all right. So another guide that we do use often is the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It speaks to a lot of the traffic control warrants around any signage that's installed in the right of way, markings, temporary traffic control, which is used for maintenance of traffic on construction projects, and school area traffic control. So those are some of the major highlights or chapters of the MUTCD. Really, a lot of the MUTCD requirements, there's three big things in there that guide us. If it's a shall statement, then that's something that we must follow. Then there's shoulds and mays. So shoulds are, generally recommended, and then mays is, up to the engineer's discretion. But, example of a shall statement would be a stop sign shall be red on octagon, and there's different size requirements. So there's some technical aspects of that, but it is something that we are legally required to follow the shalls in that document. But that is another example of what we use, and also kind of ties into traffic signals and timing and crosswalks for pedestrians. But wanted to kind of talk about a few design related things that we're looking at with discussing crossing improvements. So, as you know, we've got some money set aside this year for green pavement markings. And we are reviewing how to apply those to our bike lanes and shared use paths. And we're going to work with Alta engineering and architect company to help us review criteria published by the FHWA and NACTO, and help us create some design criteria for implementing those in the community. And with that, we're kind of want to look at, we've got all sorts of different crossings of shared use paths and bike lanes across streets and driveways. We want to, make sure that we can prioritize the locations with the limited funds that we have, and also kind of identify ongoing maintenance costs to keep any markings that we have up. So that's one of the things that we're pushing for with our asset management program for any markings, whether it's lane lines, crosswalks, but I think this green pavement marking project will be important as well to help prioritize the funds that we have to putting in the new improvements and then maintaining those. So we don't currently have any guidance on that. So we're kind of looking to get a summary of some best practices that we're going to work with Alta on to bring back and start using to help us, to guide us in our implementation of that project. So we will report back on that in the future. So that is, we're just getting going on that project here in the last half of this year. At the end of last year, we kind of had a discussion on criteria that we were looking at for uncontrolled intersection crossings. I think this is something that we know that we've kind of wanted to have on some guidance on for a while. We've been following best practices when we do improvements at uncontrolled intersections. For example, the 7th and Tennessee crossing with the RRFB and the bulb out was an example. But there's some guidance that we are looking at with the Federal Highway STEP program, which is Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian, is what that acronym stands for. But that provides some good guidance, and a lot of communities have used that in different ways to create flow charts. And so I know we talked about that towards the end of last year, and that is something still on our to-do list to bring back and kind of more formalize how we want to recommend design improvements for uncontrolled crossings. So that's really focused on a few things. Of the number of lanes, the speed, and the volume of the street would help drive some of the recommendations, whether it's marked crosswalks, signage, rectangular rapid flashing beacons, those hawk signals, or any other geometric improvements, which could include curb bulb outs or reducing the length of the crosswalk. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some upcoming planning work and maybe how some of these discussions can interact with that work. We are, as you know, getting ready to update our pedestrian plan. We have a couple of MMTC commissioners that have volunteered to help be on that steering committee. The scope of that plan is still in development, so we're going to be working with the steering committee to help develop that scope, and then doing a lot of public outreach in the community on that plan update. I'd certainly expect, some discussion on prioritization of crossings, identifying where crossings are needed, and then tying in the need to have some guidance on treatments in that plan. So I think for the previous slide with uncontrolled crossings, I think there's a good technical criteria out there on how to apply it. And I think I would expect that to be an action of this pedestrian plan update in regards to crossings and design criteria. And I think that will be something that we'll be discussing. And then review of any other design criteria for pedestrian improvements, could be identified through that planning process. I mentioned uncontrolled crossings. I think, there's from what I've heard from in previous conversations, there's been questions or concerns or ideas about should we be looking at making improvements at crossings at controlled intersections, signalized controlled intersections, larger intersections. And I think that could certainly be something that is discussed with that planning work. And that would be important to have a public process on, because there could be some competing interests with that, because a lot of improvements or safety improvements for pedestrians at signalized intersections may necessitate reducing capacity for vehicular movements, or changing signal timing, or eliminating lanes. And so there's certainly things in that regard that could be discussed with that pedestrian plan. And I think there could be some opportunities there through that planning work to look at that. Also, the transportation land use best practice study, which is getting underway here soon, kind of looks at a high level at some of our street classifications, but that also ties into discussions that we've had about street width, and whether it's arterial streets, collector streets, or local streets. The classification of that street drives the minimum width of those streets in our standards. I think with that plan, looking at access management and parking drives a lot of street widths in some areas. So I think there's some opportunity through that work to see if there's anything that we need to change in our standards, or in our design elements that we want to start including in projects. So wanted to mention that, and I think those two upcoming plans kind of relate in a way to some of the discussion with crossing improvements and design standards and design criteria. So with that, I didn't have anything else. We still have a good half an hour for questions or comments or any thoughts that anyone has. And I know got Jake and Dustin here, and I think Jessica's on the line as well to help answer any questions you have on either of these areas or both.
Oops.
Pat, I think you're
This,
muted.
yeah, this is Pat Collette, Chair of MMTC. Any questions or comments from commissioners on this material? Charlie.
Commissioner Brian, MMTC. I was interested in hearing a little more about the transportation impact study guidelines, the reference documents that you directed us to show that it was updated in 2020. And I see it's a 10-step process now, or more than 10 actually, but it used to be, I think 7 or 8 or something. So I was wondering if you might be able to give us some of the background on what was changed and how that's helped our community.
You want to do it?
This is Dustin Smith with MSO. So we did publish our transportation impact study guidelines in 2020. And so there still is the 7-step study that's kind of the starting point for all development, redevelopment projects are the 7 steps that we've or that are actually, fairly industry standard. But then the expanded kind of full-blown study that's triggered when you generate more than 100 trips in the peak hour. That's where the additional, I don't remember how many steps you said, so that
Looks like
but that's-
11.
yeah, so that's the kind of just providing more detailed guidance of what we're expecting when we see those traffic studies, so we can evaluate the impacts.
My curiosity is this a step toward the idea of a multimodal traffic impact or transportation impact study? The step 10 involves pedestrian, bicyclist, transit, and truck considerations.
This is Dave Cronin, city engineer. The study is really guided to what improvements are necessary on street for intersections or access or safety. We do ask for them. We do ask for the study to include a review of transit improvements, bicycle improvements, and pedestrian improvements, because although some of those aren't necessarily required in the subdivision regulations, we do expect that the traffic engineer performing the study at least address the improvements that are being made in those areas. So I don't know if it necessarily, gets to your question on a multimodal study. It's still primarily geared towards what requirements are needed for development to mitigate traffic on the existing roadway, or what improvements will be needed in the future to accommodate traffic.
What I'm trying to figure out is, I know a few years ago, the city was, or the MPO was interested in trying to kind of expand the typical study so that it was more inclusive of all modes. And I don't believe that got funded, like in 2018. And I'm just curious where we are with that, and if this impact study update from 2020 reflected any of that aspiration. And if so, then what's the impact it's had? Or has anybody actually done a full-blown study that involves all modes?
This is Dave Cronin, city engineer. We haven't had a really many full-blown studies in the last year or two.
Okay.
So I can't, we just, published this last year. We had a lot of the information in there is pretty typical traffic related studies that were being performed already, trip generation, trip distribution. We had included that step on pedestrian, bicycles, and transit to be included. I wouldn't say it necessarily would have replace the MPO study that was not funded, but I think it made it's there to improve for an improvement. So to make sure that at a minimum it's being looked at, and that that we expect that would be included in any traffic in the scope of any traffic study that a development would submit.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, everyone. My internet got disconnected and I couldn't get back in.
Well, this is Dave Cronin. Pat, we were just talking about traffic impact studies, but if there's any other questions on that or anything else that we presented,
Okay, any other comments? I have a couple of questions. I guess, I'm thinking about this study session. What I was really looking for was to see if, you mentioned the developing standard procedures for uncontrolled intersections that happened, I guess, at the end of last year, and the discussion about it. And that was what I was kind of looking for on controlled intersections as well. I know, I'm familiar with all of the different guidance that exists out there, but I guess, from the perspective of the commission, when, project comes to us, what, how are we looking at that with, melding all of those different documents? I'm looking at the Bikeway plan again. There's some pretty good guidance in there, but I don't know if that has the strength of policy when it comes to these decisions and the design of intersections, or really what I'm really talking about, I guess, that are side path and shared use path at intersections. So really for bikeway, for bikes and pedestrians, and how those are treated when they're redesigned or, when improvements are made. And so just whether or not there exists a policy, is that something that as a commission we can work on as far as developing those policies, or in your view, do they already exist as a policy?
Yeah, Dave Cronin's the engineer. We do not have a policy on crossing of bike facilities at signalized intersections or unsignalized intersections. But I think that could be something that is, maybe discussed with either the land use best practice or the pedestrian plan. So shared use path is a bike facility and a pedestrian facility, but I think whether it's a shared use path or a sidewalk crossing a controlled intersection, a signalized intersection, that could be specifically reviewed or with the pedestrian plan.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, both the pedestrian plan and the bikeway plan, I think, in terms of the content there, and how those are, what that policy might look like, or how it gets to the level of, so it's, when you've got a project coming up and you're looking at that intersection, and what thresholds, so it's more prescriptive, I guess, as far as prioritizing the kinds of improvements that should be made, when there's a certain traffic volume, crash rate, level of comfort, all of those elements that would go into a prioritization for particular design aspects in that intersection with the interaction with bike ped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, so far we use the level of comfort from the bike plan to decide the facility, but we don't have a level of comfort measure or any criteria for intersections.
So can I interject here for a second? Because the Jessica Mortinger, transportation planning manager, the bike plan also does have a criteria checklist that's in it that has some of the things that you're mentioning, Pat, about crossings.
Mhm.
It was something that we got from Alta and they allowed us permission to use. And I'm trying to pull it up to kind of share with you. So while that is not codified, that's the design. Those are guidelines, options kind of for a design guide.
Mhm.
And those are that implementation of that really comes down to in the design process, I think, of how that gets carried out. Do you know what I mean? As in terms of if it's included within the scope of the project and how that's happening, because there is in that, both in the design guide we have where it talks about within each element, how you handle certain intersections.
Right.
And there is also a, I'm still trying to find it. So, and then I'm going to share with you all. So I think some of this exists, and maybe that's where there just needs to be a little more study. So here, hopefully you can see I have the bike plan pulled up, and I'm in the design guide section called intersection and conflict zone treatments.
Mhm.
So there is a bunch of guidance in here around crossing design, and there are some standards based on like which type of bikeway in some cases it talks about in each design, each category of bikeway type, which types of crossings or improvements are acceptable. So more than that, it's not prescriptive, just like every other, just like the bikeway types aren't prescriptive in the plan. It's really context sensitive. And so we kind of perceived that as needing to be determined often when you're doing design, right? And so there is also a table, and I was trying to find that because I don't here. This is exactly like what you were talking about, I think, a little bit.
Right.
So this has speed and volume. And here you can see where it recommends which type of crossing. This is the pedestrian crossing guidance, but many of this can also apply to bikes. And this is similar to that step document that Dave was previously talking about, but it's in the plan where it talks about which crossing treatments are desirable versus not recommended versus engineering judgment based on the lane types and the speed.
Mhm.
So
And
some of
this
this exists in
That's for
guidance already.
unsignalized intersections.
Yes.
These
So-
are signalized, you said?
Yeah, this is at unsignalized intersections. That's what he's
Okay,
saying right
okay.
here for,
Yeah. Oh, right. I see it there.
yeah.
But there's not a similar thing for signalized intersections.
No, I think that's the topic I think that we're hearing that you have interest in
Mhm.
talking about. And that's the one where we have, because it's already signalized, none of these improvements would be appropriate at it, right? Because it already would have a crosswalk. It could ideally under design, it should have, push button beacon. And if it's integrated with shared use path, what does that mean? We obviously use the new NACTO standards MSO did when they designed the 21st and Mass bike crossing. So that would be a good example of, we did an improvement at an unsignalized place by putting in a signal that has special things. So the NACTO guide for signalized intersections has things like specific bike crossings and bike boxes. And we've used those in a few instances.
Mhm.
But there isn't, that guidance exists, but it's not a checklist like this. It's more about its design criteria that can be chosen when a project is implemented.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I brought up to Dave as an example, I guess, and I just remember, I think when I first came on the commission and the intersection or the work at Clinton Parkway and Castle was completed, and I remember Commissioner Hayden making the comment, the intersection feels a lot different than what they were seeing on the plans along the way. And, and I agree with that, and it's like when you're looking at that intersection and, what it takes for a pedestrian or a bicyclist to go through that intersection is pretty daunting. And so I'm just curious what we can do to move that process forward so that, before the work gets done, that we're looking at each element to ensure that, not only, sufficient traffic is able to travel through automobile traffic, but also that it's a safe intersection for bike ped.
Yeah. So thinking about speed and volume, which are going to be higher at those intersections because those are arterial streets, and then also probably just turning movements, right? We've made strategic design decisions for automobiles to add double left turn lanes or right turn lanes, and how the signal control operates in terms of what it allows for crossing time at some of those, or probably many of those considerations.
Right. Yeah, I'm in the process of teaching my 16-year-old grandson to drive. And we go through that intersection, and there's a lot of you realize how much information, a driver needs to have and what they're seeing to make sure they don't, that there aren't collisions with bike ped, let alone other cars. But, really interested in how we can, and at what point we see those kind of checklists, I guess, so that, when we're looking at a project and recommending that it go forward, that we know, what elements have been looked at and what possibilities could be there.
Yeah, this is Dave Cronin, city engineer. Well, I think the existing checklist that we have to review, that would be our complete streets checklist. So it may not specifically say signalized intersection improvements, but it has a checklist that includes the narrower driving lanes, pedestrian facilities, crosswalks, sidewalks, mid-block crosswalks, some of those treatments. So that's what we have today. So that's kind of that's the design checklist or interaction between the development of these plans that we bring to you and your review of complete streets elements, whether it's traffic calming or bike ped facilities. So that's what we have today.
You mentioned the Alta study, and you haven't scoped that yet, but do you anticipate that could be since they've done a lot of work in that area, that's, in terms of developing that design guide for both controlled and uncontrolled intersections could be a part of that work, or is that really beyond the scope?
Dave Cronin, city engineer. Well, currently we're working on the scope for the green pavement marking project. So it probably more ties into using green pavement marking for shared use paths or side paths crossing side streets or driveways, or green pavement marking at intersections, which it could include signalized intersections. So that could certainly evolve. I think the next step would be to come up with some prioritization for those improvements. So I think at first we're trying to get some help on reviewing standards and guidance and best practice. And then if there's any gap that for that project or through any of these other planning projects that we see the need to look into a little more, we're certainly open to do that. Like, we are interested in moving safety forward and looking for ways to do that. And we've got some good things in the toolbox, but there's certainly some other things out there that we're interested in seeing if there's things that we don't know about, or other policies specific to signalized intersections, which may necessitate changing signal timing that doesn't prioritize vehicles. So we're trying to balance everything. It's safety, cost, and movement of people via all devices. So we've done a lot of work with signal optimization, with a synchronization plan. We've done a review of crosswalk timing with that. So there's been some improvements to allow more timing for pedestrians to cross. So I think that's important as well. But we're also trying to move vehicles as well. So it's a balance. And I think if we're looking at making additional safety improvements at signalized intersections, we would need to have a conversation on that could lead to reducing capacity for vehicles or increased delay, because that could include shorter crossings or changes to the signal timing. It's very complex. I wish there was an easy answer.
Right.
I really do. It's so.
I guess this is Pat Collette, Chair, MMTC. I guess one question I have would be, is there something that we as a commission can do to help move that process forward, as far as more guidelines, or is it really sequenced, do you think, we've got the pedestrian plan and also the best practice on street design studies coming up? Is that something that you would see coming out of that process, to, updating the pedestrian plan, the best practices, and then moving forward with some more prescriptive design guidelines? Online there are several examples of, particularly I think it came out of state DOTs, but it was, and a lot of them were done by not Alta, but a couple of other of the, the consultants that are involved in bike ped planning. And so pretty comprehensive design guide with a lot of that kind of information. And so, it seems like that'd be something that we could draw on as an aid to moving something forward. But I don't know if there's, a sequence that you see would work best, but either Dave or Jessica, whether you see that as making more sense.
This is Dave Cronin, city engineer. I think the pedestrian plan is a good opportunity for discussion on crossings, whether it's uncontrolled or controlled. I think we have a lot of, we know we want to make improvements on crossings and identify and prioritize where we want to make improvements. And I know that kind of ties into our non-motorized project prioritization plan a little bit, on identifying those crossings and scoring them and putting in the improvements. So I think that's my opinion. Jessica, do you have any additional thoughts on opportunities through the planning process?
Jessica Martin, your transportation planning manager. So we're trying to scope all of that work and just to figure out what actually is going to be realistic to accomplish in the workload. And so we're going to keep tackling those issues. I think Dave's right that a lot of the crossing stuff we're going to try to address in the pedestrian plan, particularly prioritizing and identifying some crossings to be evaluated, likely unsignalized crossings to be evaluated for crossing improvements, to be added to a future prioritization list that you guys evaluate for future improvements, like for implementation, and also a process to do that more systematically with some of that looking at the step and making considerations for those improvements, probably similar to the checklist that's in the Bikeway plan. We'll go back through and evaluate that again as we go through this process. But the signalized stuff, I think we're we'll have to figure out. We can keep talking about it. I think we can talk about it in terms of the scope. We can see if there's appropriate things to fit in terms of the scope or recommendations we can make in terms of best practices. It does get into some more challenging issues. It's not like the other crossing at unsignalized. Those are pretty standalone crossing projects that are pedestrian projects. So you can fit them within the street design. The other conversation about changes at signalized intersections have a lot larger conversation as part of, this, the long range transportation plan in terms of level of service that's delivered and how that's conventionally calculated to automobiles and the considerations with delay, which also then has environmental impacts. And so there's larger conversations, I think, that have to happen too as part of that. It's not just a prioritized pedestrians conversation. It's prioritize pedestrian safety, but here's the boatload of other values that come along with that in terms of making a transportation system multimodal, which in the reality of that does include a lot of cars, and that's how the majority of people travel in our community. And so while I think those things are things we can have, I think they're going to have to be big conversations about how the city probably in the future decides if they want to redesign how they, handle those intersection improvements that also have lots of benefits to safety for all users. So I'm not sure
Yeah,
how much of that will fit in the pedestrian scope.
Yeah, this is Dave Cronin, city engineer. I wanted to add, we did reach out to KDOT as they're working on their active transportation plan and kind of asked them if they had any update on design criteria they were considering for pedestrian crossing improvements. And I think they were hoping to have some toolkits with their crosswalk policy and some guidance document based off the FHWA step countermeasures. But again, I think those countermeasures are mainly geared towards uncontrolled crossings. So I don't know what maybe they may include for crosswalks at signalized intersections, but that may help us tie on to recommendations or things that they are reviewing with that statewide active transportation plan.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to open it up to public comment. Looks like Michael Almon has his hand raised. Would you like to make a comment, Michael?
Yes, good evening. Michael Almon. Guess I'm speaking for myself tonight. I'd like to point out a few things here. First of all, as the commission learned discussing the East 19th Street project, that what is listed on slide number 2 tonight, standard detail sheets, those are not set in stone. They're what the city engineer decides to include from all the various resources at his disposal, whether it's NACTO or Ashto or Mutkud or any of a number of things. He selects what he wants to put in those design details. So keep in mind that when you're working on some guidelines for intersections or other projects, that you have quite a bit of latitude for selecting different specifications. It's not locked in by code, by shalls, for example. As far as uncontrolled intersections, one thing that you need to be considering, I would think, would be cycle tracks, which are dedicated to cycles and not pedestrians, and not something appropriate to be considered in the pedestrian plan. I hesitate to think that, if you want to work up bicycle guidelines for intersections, as Chair Collette has pointed out, policies or whatever, it needs to be addressed independently in concert with pedestrian, but not within the context exclusively of a pedestrian plan. It should be covered both in the bicycle perspective and the pedestrian perspective. One reason I say that is that bicycles will be approaching an intersection at, well, probably 2 or 3 times the speed of a pedestrian. So it's much less likely that a motorist will see them, out of the periphery, or over their shoulder or whatever. So Jessica Mortinger pointed out in one of her first illustrations there, protected intersections. That's a good example of how you increase the visibility at intersections, particularly for bicyclists that are approaching rapidly. So I hope you consider that as part of in your scope. That would cover like intersection radius, which is an issue that Commissioner Bowen has brought up many times. And then finally, I noticed that the city began yesterday, apparently, the pavement markings rehabilitation project to upgrade a lot of and restore a lot of the pavement markings around roundabouts near schools, at intersections, what have you. I would like to ask the engineer if he would fill us in on, I hope he's not putting the cart before the horse, that there are 151 intersections funded in 2020 by the City Commission for green pavement markings, as you probably know. And that is to be installed this year. It's this year's budget. How does that fit into this intersection pavement improvement upgrade go? If you don't have your green pavement design standards yet, what are you going to be doing with these intersections? They're supposed to be marked with green pavement. And the project in the capital improvement plan specifies that those primarily are going to be 2 foot by 10 foot green bars spaced on, I think it's 4 foot centers. I'd have to go back and look. So I'd like to have the city engineer, if he would, tell us more about both of those projects. Thank you.
Sure, this is Dave Cronin, city engineer. In regards to the green pavement marking project, I mentioned we're working on looking at how and where to apply those, and what the best practice is. So we have not determined the locations or the material or any of the details on that project yet, but we're looking to move that forward here this year and proceed with that project. Dustin might be able to speak better to the pavement marking project that's going on, but overall, we're restoring all sorts of markings, as Mr. Almon mentioned, at roundabouts and crossings around schools. So that's mainly geared towards restoring existing crosswalks, existing long lines, yield lines, all sorts of markings that would not negate improvements for green pavement for a crossing. So I think they would be completely separate projects. Correct.
Yeah, Dustin Smith, MSO. Yeah, the pavement marking rehab project that started this week is maybe more accurately described as a maintenance project. It's restoring the existing pavement markings to, a new condition. And all of the locations included in that project are locations where the pavement markings are in bad shape and we're coming through and replacing them. So, and as Dave mentioned, that doesn't negate any of those locations possibly being included with the green pavement marking project when we get those guidelines developed and get that project implemented.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other questions or comments from commissioners? We're getting close to our end of our study session here. So if anyone would like to make some final comments before we adjourn to the regular meeting. I don't see any, so we'll It's 6:01, so let's adjourn to 6:10. We'll start our regular meeting. Thanks, Dave and Jessica and Dustin for this study session. It's got a lot of good information in it for us to kind of help move forward. It's 6:10. I think we're ready to get started as soon as everyone gets back here. Looks like we're just waiting for Dave. Dave, are you there or?
I'm here.
Okay, okay. I saw your picture there. It didn't look like you were here. Okay, great. I think we're ready to get started. This is Pat Collette, Chair, MMTC, calling the regular meeting of MMTC September 1st to order. I'd like to start off with roll call.
Right. Charlie Bryan,
Here.
Gregory Critchlow,
Here.
Court Buffington,
Here.
Steve Evans, Carol Bowen, Nick Kuzmiak, Aaron Payton. Here. Patricia Collette
Here.
and David Cronin.
I'm here. We have a quorum.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, the first item on the agenda is to approve the minutes from the August 2nd meeting. Has everyone had a chance to read through those and see if there are any needs for corrections or additions? If there are none, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
This is Commissioner Bryan. I move to approve the August 2nd minutes.
Thank you. Do I hear a second? A second from Aaron Payton. Okay, all in favor? Raise your hand. I think we can do that with this one.
All right.
Got it?
Thanks.
All
Yep.
right.
5-0.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to call for any public comment. Is there anyone who would like to make a comment, either in person or on the Zoom call?
This is Dave Cronin, city engineer. There's no one here in person. Looks like we've got Mr. Almon's raised his hand.
Okay, Michael, would you like to go ahead and make a comment?
Hi, yes, I would. Thank you very much. Michael Almon with Sustainability Action Network. Last May, in the context of the annual street maintenance program that the city upgrades streets every year, there was a discussion that focused on the white stripe bicycle lanes, as you probably recall. And Sustainability Action Network pointed out that we don't find them useful, effective, economic, or safe. And since then, I have met with and discussed this with any number of commissioners in the Multi-Modal Transportation Commission, as well as 4 of the city commissioners. Cut to the chase, basically, I'd like to see some kind of a policy that would make it clear that the white stripe bicycle lanes no longer are the default when nothing else is specified. And pretty much everyone, well, I should say everyone I've talked to thinks this is worth discussing, and quite a few feel that that kind of a policy is called for. Mayor Finkeldye, for instance, said on the 19th of May, yes, I think this is something the bicycle committee and or multimodal should take up as a policy change. Thanks for working on it. So I would like to see that this be something initiated by the Multimodal Transportation Commission, because that's what the mayor has indicated should happen. That's what Commissioner Boley has indicated should happen. That's what Vice Mayor Shipley has indicated should happen. And Commissioner Lisa Larson as well, that if this is a policy discussion, it should originate at the Multimodal Transportation Commission, and they would like to see that policy. So that's what I'm asking for. In addition, there are a couple other policies. The green pavement markings policy is one that may or may not be moot at this point. I'm curious to see what comes of Mr. Cronin's exploring the different design standards. But standards, as I said before, are optional. You know, policies are a little stronger. And it should be something that is clearly indicated as we move forward. So that's a potential policy discussion. And the third one that City Commissioner Boley has talked about on a number of occasions, including the multimodal transportation retreat, was what he called the Oregon stop, or the bicyclist yield stop. So those are three policies that I would think are worthy of discussion, and I would hope that the Multimodal Transportation Commission would move them forward and initiate them. So that's basically what I wanted to mention, and I appreciate your time and your work.
Thank you, Michael.
And I think what I meant was that this would be something for a study session to start with. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. We'll move on to the first agenda item under D. Consider recommending approval of the revised 2022-26 5-year plan projects. Is that Jake?
Yes, good evening, Chair and Commissioners. Jake Baldwin, Engineering Program Manager for MSO. Tonight I'm presenting a revision to our previously approved 5-year plan for non-motorized projects. This revision was brought about after the City Commission voted to defer the approval of the 5-year plan back in July because the recommended capital improvement plan includes a multimodal improvement project along Massachusetts Street in 2024 in the same area as a pedestrian project P012 in 2022 of our 5-year plan. That project in particular is on the west side of Massachusetts Street between 23rd and 21st Street. The City Commission did not want that project P012 included in the 5-year plan, knowing the larger project was scheduled to produce these improvements in 2024. So with this change in mind, staff is asking for approval of a revised 5-year plan, and that includes the following changes. Number one is the removal of that project P012 from 2022. Again, that's Massachusetts from 23rd to 21st Street on the west side. We're going to move project P197 from 2025 to 2022. That's Main Street on the east side from 6th Street to 4th Street. So again, we're taking out P12 and we're moving P197 into that slot that P12 occupied. And then the third change is to add project P263 to the year 2025 in the 5-year plan. That's going to be the south side of West 21st Street from Tennessee to Louisiana. That project was added to the plan because of its high score in the non-motorized projects prioritization policy project list. as well as being on a safe routes to school, and also having a project budget that fits in with the available funding due to this shift. These revisions will not affect the change in equity within the 5-year plan, as the removed project and the new project are directly adjacent to each other. In addition to asking for approval of this revised 5-year plan, we're also asking for direction to incorporate the scoring of equity into the non-motorized project prioritization policy. And it would be staff's recommendation to utilize transportation disadvantaged populations metric that was used recently in the approved data-driven process for prioritizing sidewalk repairs with the sidewalk improvement program. So in summary, staff is asking for approval for the revised 5-year plan, as well as direction on including equity within the non-motorized projects prioritization policy. And that basically wraps up the information I was going to present tonight. So I'd be happy to take any questions you have at this point. Thanks.
Thank you, Jake. This is Pat Collette, MMTC Chair. I did want to bring to everyone's attention the equity impact statement that has been added to the agenda item report. They were also added, they actually started last month, and I failed to call those out, but I wanted to make sure everyone has noticed that within the intent, per our discussions on equity, is to add that statement to each of the agenda items into the future. The Equity Impact Committee met this week, and I, Charlie or Gregory, would you like to make any comments on this, and also on Jake's request for consideration on the scoring?
This is Commissioner Brian, MMTC. Well, I appreciate the addition of the map to show us visually where these projects are located in relation to the transportation disadvantaged population score. I'll just note that the addition of P263 is in an area that had a relatively low transportation disadvantaged population score. It's in the less than or equal to 2. I'm not sure that's consequential to us tonight, but I just think as we look at these projects that are on our prioritization list and think about how they're scoring with our current policy, that current policy doesn't consider where the project is located in relation to these disadvantaged areas.
Gregory Critchlow, MMTC Commissioner. I believe we're referring to the document that we reviewed this past Monday during our equity meeting. I think having those comments is made possible by the document that has been provided, which has been pretty extensive and showing the ratings of the transit equity within the areas that we're speaking of. And I think that was one of the really kind of very helpful understanding pieces of our meeting on Monday. And then what we had talked about in terms of the classifications, specifically to what I believe it was called a equitable or transit environment, something of that nature, but just the classification between what is and what is not. And I think as we move forward, cross-referencing these documents as a new policy is implemented and looking at these projects.
Yeah, this is Pat Collette, Chair. Jessica provided at that meeting on Monday, provided a pretty in-depth discussion about the transportation disadvantage score. And I think the subcommittee is looking at, how that could be incorporated into more specific guidance as far as prioritization on projects to make sure that equity score represents really represents the need in the community, and that maybe in this discussion, moving away from the environmental justice rating, which, as she mentioned, was yes, no, and as a federal requirement, but this is with transportation disadvantage, a little more nuanced, that can give us a better sense of projects and how they, how they are distributed throughout the community. Is that a fair representation, Jessica, in terms of?
Yeah, Jessica Morton, your Transportation Planning Manager, and I'm happy to explain or answer or show any of our reference guides for transportation disadvantaged populations or environmental justice zones if anybody is interested in hearing more about that, to be reminded of that as you have this conversation.
Great, thank you. And I think, the upshot of all of that is that the Equity Committee will continue to meet to refine that guidance to be presented to the commissioner, to the commission at a later date. I know at least another couple of meetings are planned to kind of, develop that into a more complete guidance for us as commissioners. So with that, if there aren't any questions about either the, well, I guess, Jake, could you just kind of reiterate the, what the action is that you would like in terms of the equity score and moving that into the prioritization, kind of exactly how you're wanting us to look at that?
Jake Baldwin, Engineering Program Manager. I think the action would be to direct staff to incorporate equity into the non-motorized projects prioritization policy. And if the commission wants that to be transportation disadvantaged populations per the staff recommendation, I think that should be part of the action.
This is Dave Cronin, City Engineer. I just want to make sure we clarify this. So I think the action, we want to get the approval of the revised plan tonight, but then also I would say if you wanted to include an action on the intent to revisit the policy next spring, to include a review of including equity scoring into the policy prior to our 2023 to 2027 proposal. So I think we don't necessarily need to say that we're going to use this method tonight, but just to have the intent that we intend to include that before we bring back the next 5-year plan next spring. If that helps.
That helps. Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll have first we'll have a vote on the revisions to the the current plan to make those 3 revisions suggested in the 5-year plan. Do I have a motion to approve?
Do we have any public comment?
I don't see any.
This is Dave Cronin, City Engineer. We don't have anyone present for public comment, and no one has signed up, but you can see if there's anyone online that would like to provide public comment.
Sure. Is there anyone online that would like to provide public comment on this topic? Okay, I don't see any.
This is Commissioner Bryan, MMTC. I recommend approval of the revised 2022-26 5-year plan for non-motorized projects.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second? A second from Aaron Hayden, Commissioner Hayden. All right. All in favor, we'll have a roll call for this.
Right. Gregory Critchlow,
Yes.
Court Buffington,
Yes.
and Aaron Payton,
Yes.
Patricia Colette.
Yes.
Motion carried.
Thank you. Okay, then on a second item, a motion to direct staff to look at including an equity measurement in the when we look at the 2023 27 5-year plan, either with transportation disadvantage or some other measurement of that, of equity. Is there a motion?
How about so moved? I think we're just looking for the wording for it.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, right. Okay, so Commissioner Bryan moved. And is there a second?
Court Buffington, MMTC, second.
Okay, thank you. Can we have a roll call, please?
Right. Gregory Critchlow
Yes.
and Erin Payton
Yes.
and Patricia Colette.
Yes,
Motion carried.
thank you. All right. So next item on the agenda is to discuss the 2021 MMTC goal to measure the progress of the board, and with an action of determining next steps to move this goal forward. So in your packet, you had, part of at our retreat, we included we're really looking at the bylaws, looking at the ordinance, and then another one in terms of really measuring our performance and progress towards those goals and towards the goals that are identified in the, well, specifically in the ordinance. And so, what we wanted to do with, since this is September and we're getting down to the end, don't have very many meetings before the end of the year, is to look at, what process we can use to review those and to make sure that we're making progress, or that we can quantify in some way the progress that we've made towards those goals. I'll mention that, basically I've gone through the bylaws and the ordinance, and there aren't, particularly in the bylaws, I didn't see anything that looked inconsistent with the work that we're doing. And on the ordinance, in terms of, because the bylaws don't mention specifically responsibilities, on the ordinance there are a list of responsibilities, and one of the things that I noted in that was perhaps kind of calling out a little more specifically the equity piece of it, and also a little more specifically safety, pedestrian bike safety, because it's kind of in a, not in a very explicit way. Now that's, that may still not need to be changed, but something that we might want to look at. And then the third piece of it is in terms of our performance and looking at those different goals and objectives that we set at our retreat, and going through those to kind of document the areas that we've made progress on. And I've done a little bit of that work along the way by adding action taken as another column in that matrix, and adding actions or steps that we've taken as far as study sessions or other actions to include in that. It's not complete, and I think it needs more work in order to provide us with some decent feedback. So one possibility that I thought of would be for just a small group of 2 or 3 to get together and kind of just go through those and, and flesh that out a little bit more, bring those recommendations, in terms of the bylaws and the ordinance back to the commission, as well as, basically a report out of the actions that we've taken and whether, that the rest of the commission could review and make suggestions if there's been something missed or that we need to add to it. So I don't know if anyone else has some ideas about how we might handle this, or what your recommendations would be. I do have one volunteer. Steve said he wasn't going to be able to make the meeting, or thought if he was, it might be late, and he volunteered to look at that. So and I'm certainly willing to do that too. So maybe if there was one other person who might be willing to take a look at that, and we could, make a first stab on our own and then get together. And I would just anticipate maybe one meeting of working on that. Any thoughts or volunteers?
This is Commissioner Brian, MMTC. I was kind of interested in learning a little bit more about the measures that are being, I guess, monitored related to the strategic plan.
Mhm.
And I looked at that list and I found a few things that seemed related to our work and wondered kind of what's the current status. For example, there's under outcome 2, strong and welcoming neighborhoods. Under equity and inclusion, there's a % of residential units within a half mile of a walking, biking trail. Kind of curious what we can do about that one. Outcome 3, safe and secure. There's a equity and inclusion measure that states variance of satisfaction with perceptions of safety by race, gender, education, and income. I'm curious about that in relation to transportation. I don't know if that's even possible, but I imagine that safety might be a factor for some people, especially with regard to bicycling, possibly pedestrian safety in certain parts of the community. And perhaps there's some safety concerns around use of transit. So that one, I don't know what the measure is and how it's monitored, but it'd be interesting to see if it could be kind of looked at through a lens of transportation. And then outcome 5, connected city. There's an equity and inclusion measure, % of sidewalks and shared use paths in compliance with ADA. And that one feels like maybe a pretty straightforward one that we could at least be aware of and track our progress on.
Mm-hmm. There's this is Pat Collette, on the dashboard, those performance measures that are in those, there's several different categories. So transit, I think it's bike ped, safety, several different measures there that I think are most of those from that strategic plan, I think are addressed, or some of those anyway are addressed in that dashboard on the website, and you can get
the transportation 2040.
Yeah.
I hadn't cross-referenced that, but I think where you're going though is let's at least examine what exists currently and see which of these, we see are having some role to
Right.
play. That does feel like an appropriate first step. I would wonder then what is missing, in terms of what our bylaws say our role is, and is there any way to create a metric that helps to track that?
Yeah, I think, I think one of the things is just what you said in terms of, suggestions for metrics that, when we look at those, when we overlay all of those, is there a metric missing that would be helpful in terms of looking at progress? And So that would be another dimension there.
Yeah, this is Dave Cronin, city engineer. If I could jump in, I can answer Commissioner Bryan's questions on the key performance indicators. So we've, through the strategic plan, identified these indicators under these outcome areas. So we do not yet have published benchmarks or targets yet. So those are being developed. And so where we're at now and where we want to get to, and those metrics, those are still to be determined. So we don't have that currently, but as Commissioner Bryan mentioned on some of the specific ones, they are, related to multimodal transportation and will be metrics to identify making progress in some of those areas. So we have these key performance indicators in the strategic plan. They're not, some may be similar to performance measures in our transportation plan, but certainly there's a much more comprehensive list of measures in our transportation plan that of performance measures that we're using. So there could be, part of this conversation is there anything that we're not measuring that you feel is important going forward in either of these areas? And that's, I understand we don't have all of the targets yet in the strategic plan, but we do have some targets of performance measures in our transportation plan.
This is Pat Collette, Chair. Even without the benchmarks, do you have just the raw data in terms of reporting out on those different elements of the key performance indicators? So I know that in the transportation plan it says either a hard and fast number that you're shooting for or a trend line with that particular indicator. But at this point, do you have just the measurements without the targets, or are you still developing that data?
This is Dave Cronin, city engineer. I think it's some of them, the benchmarks may have been, they're all in progress. So some of them may have been identified and some are still a work in progress. And so there's a number of staff members that are working on these. They're kind of broken out into outcome areas. And so they're in different stages of development, I would say. I've on the Safe Welcoming Neighborhoods group. And so I think we don't have anything that we could share at this point, but it's work that's ongoing.
Okay. So in terms of our work, like Charlie mentioned, is, bringing that into the review of data that we're interested in, do you see it possible to, begin this work, with the information that we have right now, and then fold in those key performance indicators as we identify, the elements that are of interest to the commission? Or does that need to happen first, I guess is my question.
Dave Cronin, the engineer. I don't necessarily think it needs to happen first. I think, there's a few indicators that are multimodal transportation related. There's a lot, probably more in our transportation plan that we've been measuring progress for a long time. And Jessica might be able to speak to that a little more, but so we've tracked performance in a number of areas. And I think that may relate a little better to this group for measuring progress. Of course, there's progress that you can make in policies too that drive the data, but this is mainly data-based metrics, particularly with what we track in our transportation plan. I guess I'd ask Jessica, if you have any additional info that would help, that would be great.
So Jessica Morton, your Transportation Planning Manager. So our last long-range plan was the first time ever we did performance-based planning, where we have performance measures included. So you'll see we're starting to get multiple years of the data sets, and I think that's where you start to get a lot of value in data in performance-based planning, is when you start to have multi-years of data and you can understand how stuff is moving. Some of the things like Charlie mentioned, where the strategic plan has remember, these are made up of staff, those strategic plan committees, and each subject area is made up of staff teams that are not all subject area experts. They're very multifaceted. So the way they've worded some of the measures, we're going to have to, I think, work on the back end to determine how that's actually calculated. So the one Charlie read first off, that's percentage of residential units in proximity to hiking, walking trails. Well, that's technically measured in the Bikeway plan. If you look at it or in T2040 in both, if you look at it where we talk about percentage of people within a certain mile access, here I can just show you. We have that here. Just give me a second. But we have that measure. We just we have it worded in a different way. We word it as shared use path. So I'm not sure if when they do that calculation, so here's this chart, what you're seeing basically is that measure we have in the plan. People who have a quarter-mile access, that's residential units, it's the way we can calculate it by percentage, who have with level of comfort to the Bikeway network. So shared use path. So currently, Lawrence, based on this data set, you're at 51%. And for environmental justice zones at the time, you're at 36%. And then you can see that for the total network too. So some of those things, we have this data. It's just about how they decide to draw the boundaries and define the data sets to calculate. And part of that will be kind of fascinating. In the strategic plan for progress indicators, if you pay particular attention to connected city, there's this percentage of residents satisfied or very satisfied with the experience of various transportation modes. This was actually a question we asked in the last Transportation 2040 plan development, but it wasn't statistically significant. So this is going to be a particular measure where when Dave talks about they're in different phases of development, this is going to have to be multiple new questions that are added to the statistically significant ETC survey that the city does. And so some of these measures, and this is part of the work the staff is doing now, is trying to gather about, we think this is the measure to track progress under these areas, under these commitment areas through each outcome area. And some of it there is data existing for, like percentage of trips not taken in an automobile. This is a census-defined data set. It's also something we track in T2040. Miles of trails. Depending on how they define trails in this situation for the strategic plan, does that include just 8-foot shared use path, 8-foot plus shared use path, if that's the case, because you want to consider accessibility and it doesn't include off-road dirt trails. So there's a bunch of, I think, caveats that determine whether or not the measure, how it's going to get reported in here and defined versus how it's already defined in Transportation 2040. I think the other thing that'll be interesting to see too, is we start to track stuff, and I have this on the other staff items, so it's kind of a preface to that, but is, level of comfort. We talked about that. We have the level of comfort from 2019 in the Bikeway plan. It's not in T2040 because that got developed after T2040. It could be something we develop in the future. So you can see how many miles of each type of infrastructure exist in 2019 at each level, each comfort level. And you can see that in 2021, and you can start to see the difference, both the increase in amenities by type, but also the change in comfort based on things like the neighborhood traffic management program, which had neighborhood speed reductions to 25. That because the level of comfort's based on posted speed and volumes from our model. We'll start to see some of that and be able to track that progress. So I think there's a lot of caveats about the data and what comes first. I think there's a lot of information available to you already in the MPO planning processes, whether that be T2040 or the bike plan. And I think the strategic plan is taking a different angle on it because it's not just looking at transportation. So in relation to the perceptions of safety one, as far as I know, if that question doesn't say transportation, the conversation has not been about transportation safety. The conversation has been about probably physical or personal safety. And so those are things where that plan is talking about a lot more. It's a more holistic performance-based plan that's looking at a lot of competing values and interests. And so that's one where I think you could weigh in on that. We could also have conversations about if there's other things that aren't in T2040 that are things we'd like to track, how would we go about doing that? Oftentimes in that process, we've studied best practices for what we can track. We get caught often in, is the data available to us? How expensive is it? Do you have to purchase it? What does it look like to maintain it? It takes us an extraordinary amount of time to do that planning. So my recommendation to you would be to try to work through these planning processes or these other performance-based plannings, whether that even be the community health improvement plan has many target measures, some of which relate back to transportation and access, some of which are similar to T2040, some of them aren't. But if you don't understand where the data is coming from and what it's actually trying to tell us, then you have to really spend some time with it. Otherwise, you could be measuring similar things but get very different answers.
Commissioner Brian, MMTC. I just wanted to point out, I was looking at the community health plan as well, because I knew there were some measures in there related to access through transportation. The Safe Routes to School programs, which we have been supporting for many years, those are in the community health plan. It looks as if the Lawrence School District's walking and biking rates have finally exceeded the goal that was set. So that's good news. I think similar to the city's strategic plan and T2040, there are multiple plans in the community, and it would, I think, be really useful if we could kind of connect those to what we think is our work, so that we can be paying attention and be aware of, at least, of the work being done throughout the community that's related to our scope. One thing that we might be able to bring uniquely to that community conversation about equity is using the transportation disadvantaged population scores to maybe add another layer to these metrics. In Jessica's little presentation there with the T2040 measures, she shows the EJ measure, which is a subset of the entire county. And I think it would be interesting to also know what that score looks like for the transportation disadvantaged areas, for example. So maybe there's a way that we can take, an element of the city's strategic plan scorecard and further dissect it by adding that. Maybe that's only for us, but maybe we can also share that. So I think, for example, percent of sidewalks and shared use paths in compliance, I'd like to see that, not citywide, but citywide plus in the transportation disadvantaged areas. I think that could be interesting to look at.
And Charlie, Jessica Morton, Transportation Planning Manager. Charlie, that's something I'm having conversations internally with MSO staff about the availability to do as part of the pedestrian plan. So now that we are using that transportation disadvantaged populations data set, and if that's the motion we want to move forward to really try to impact people with vulnerable transportation needs, then I think that's, as far as the MPO is concerned, we will move forward to try to use that in all of our existing condition analyses to start to tell the story about where we believe there might be disparity, to target resources to some of the most vulnerable people who have the most need for multimodal trip making.
There's some information on the access to healthy food goal area for the community health plan. I think when we think about why people need transportation, access to food is critical, and probably we need to be more aware of that as a commission so that we can, make better decisions if it supports efforts in the community to improve transportation to those destinations.
Charlie, I'd point out, Jessica Martin, your Transportation Planning Manager, I'd point out that in the strategic plan under environmental sustainability area of the outcome to strong and welcoming neighborhoods, there's a measure for connectivity of healthy food providers by transit, bike routes, and sidewalk. I'm not sure yet how that's going to be measured, but they're looking at it.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I would say that just at first review of what the city's strategic plan is, there's a pretty significant number of these measures that relate that we should feel a connection to. So I think this is going to be exciting to see the city build this out, and maybe there's some way that we can kind of review on a regular basis the ones that we kind of earmark as transportation related.
Okay, so that being said, is there anyone else who would like to volunteer for the subcommittee to take a first crack at reviewing these? I think the first crack is really the internal processes, and then moving into the performance measures and identifying the things that are out there that that would relate to our commission.
This is Commissioner Bryan. I'd be happy to be on a committee for that.
Great. Thanks. Well, I'll get in touch sometime in the next week or so. We can set up a time to get together. All right.
I hear Court's looking for something to do.
Yeah. Okay, let's, well, I guess we need to take some action on that to establish the subcommittee. Is that right, Dave? Should we establish that subcommittee with those as members?
Yeah, this is Dave Cronin, the engineer. If you'd like to establish a committee, I would recommend taking an action on it and specifying what the committee's reviewing.
Okay. Great. Well, so I guess I'll move to establish a subcommittee on performance measures and MMTC documents for review, which will include bylaws, the ordinance, and the action plan for the strategic plan, or for our individual action plan, and then finally performance measures from the city and other relevant planning documents, with membership of myself, Charlie Bryan, and Steve Evans. Is there a second?
Commissioner Bryan, I'll second that.
Okay. All in favor, have a roll call?
Let's see, Charlie Bryan seconded. And Gregory Critchlow,
Agree.
Court Buffington,
Yes.
Aaron Payton,
Yes.
and Charlie Bryan.
Yes.
Yes. Right, motion carried.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's move on to staff items. Staff item number 1, the 2021 Neighborhood Traffic Management Plan update.
This is Dustin Smith with MSO, and wanted to bring you an update with the neighborhood traffic management program. We've got several pieces of it that are in motion right now. So I'll start off with the neighborhood traffic management pilot program. I have to think to remember that name every time. But so we had the application process open for the neighborhoods to apply to be part of the pilot program this year. And our selection committee reviewed the applications and like to announce that we selected Old West Lawrence as our neighborhood that we're going to study as part of the pilot this year. So moving forward in the next several weeks, we'll be coordinating with the neighborhood representatives and our design consultant to determine locations and treatment types for installation of temporary traffic calming devices. And then we'll follow up that installation with the evaluation of the effectiveness of the temporary traffic calming devices and use that results of the evaluation to inform our what types and locations for permanent traffic calming devices that would be installed as part of the 2022 Neighborhood Traffic Management Program. Next item of the program that's in progress is our fall relaunch of the Safer Speeds campaign. Again, targeted at students as they're returning to town for in-person classes, and get a plug in for anyone who'd like to help promote the campaign by using the materials we have available, yard signs, posters, et cetera, are available to pick up on a walk-in basis at the 3 of the rec centers. And the final item that we have still is the ongoing targeted speed enforcement with the police department. We have dedicated funding to continue the targeted enforcement through the end of this year. And the data on the enforcement will be included in the final report for the campaign, as that the two were intended to complement each other. So we'll have that data in the report. And that's the update on the program. I'll take any questions if you have them.
This is Commissioner Bryan, MMTC. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the selection of Old West Lawrence and, for example, like how many neighborhoods submitted, what, given it's the first year, I'm just kind of curious how it went and if you were satisfied with the number of applicants in the process.
This is Dustin Smith with MSO. I would say I was surprised that we only had 2 applications for this first year, but both applications were strong, and it was a difficult decision because both applicants did do a good job of kind of following the intended process with the application. Was, they both showed strong, broad-based support from the neighborhood to be part of the program. They had organized representation that would be able to speak for the neighborhood, make decisions. But we did end up selecting Old West Lawrence. I'm thinking back on if there was a real kind of key deciding factor, other than maybe just a little stronger organization with they had an established traffic management team as part of their neighborhood association that is already kind of looking at traffic concerns from the residents and the neighborhood association and working with that established entity, hopefully will make the pilot year go a little smoother.
Thank you for sharing that.
Any other questions of Dustin? All right, thank you, Dustin. Let's move on to the next item, the Lawrence Bikes Plan Performance Measure Update. And I think we began that discussion a little bit earlier, but provide
This is
Go ahead.
Dave Cronin, city engineer. We're going to provide this update on next month's agenda. I had it on here as a placeholder and did not remove it before I published the agenda. So we will bring this back in October. And we will link it to the agenda.
Great, thank you. How about PTAC update? I don't know if we don't have Carol or Nick on. I don't know if we have anyone that can provide update on that. Maybe not.
Gregory Critchlow with MMTC. The only update that I have last meeting was another presentation from the transit stop, the two transit stops that are in design process right now, and then addressing some feedback from some of the retail or commercial occupants especially on Massachusetts Street, and trying to understand their concerns, because there at this point doesn't seem to be a lot of favor of it. So understanding concerns and figuring out a way to be able to present the project in a way that is a positive way for the city to evolve.
Mm-hmm.
But so that was the main discussion at the last PTAC.
Great, thank you. Any other questions of Gregory about that? All right, thank you. So the transit route redesign committee update, same thing, I think, with that. So I think we're ready to move on to the calendar.
Yes, is Dave
Well, I
Cronin.
guess maybe any other commission items, actually.
Yep.
Does anyone have any other items they'd like to bring forward tonight? Okay, I don't see any. So let's move on to the calendar.
All right, Dave Cronin, city engineer. Looking ahead, October 4th is our next meeting. The study session, we're going to have Jasmine Moore come and discuss sustainability in coordination with transportation. That was an area of our work plan this year for the board, and one of the goals was coordination of sustainability. I believe there's going to be a survey coming out soon in regards to going forward with the climate action plan that Jasmine's going to come speak to for the study session. So we'll be plugging that in on the 4th. And then we had indicated we would bring the Wakarusa Drive concept plans for review. So we're right now proceeding with the design of that. Not sure if we will have that ready or not for the 4th, but we have it as a placeholder. If not, that would likely be pushed to November. We do expect to have a presentation on the South Lawrence Traffic Way West Leg improvements, particularly the improvements related to the connection of city streets and bike ped improvements that would be completed with that project. That project including expansion of K10 between Iowa and the Turnpike at I-70 to 4 lanes. And so there's interchange improvements, and that will also include multimodal improvements. So we would like to get some feedback on those plans at next month's meeting. And my understanding is they're These would be like the field check or 50% stage plans, so we can have a relatively good understanding of what the plans are. Still have a couple more years to go for proceeding with getting final plans on that project. So a lot of work to do, but wanted to get that out as early as we could, just to get a review of that and get some feedback. So that is what we anticipate for October. And we've indicated a few items for the regular meeting in November. The Lawrence Loop plans. And wanted to maybe have a early discussion or presentation on what projects that would be that are in the 2022 capital improvement plan after that gets approved. So we have that as a placeholder, and then trying to bring this street maintenance plan for next year a little earlier than we have in the past. So we're going to attempt to do that in November. With that, I would stand for any questions.
Any questions of Dave?
Charlie Bryan, MMTC Commissioner. On the future study session topics list, the land use and transportation best practices is just kind of hanging out there. And I was wondering, I know you guys are working on something related to that. Is there any update on that?
This is Dave Cronin, city engineer. We don't have an update yet. We're still getting the team and the scope of that study together. I would anticipate November, December, that could be a study session item for providing an update of that planning process. So it's just getting underway. And so, but we do anticipate bringing that back before the end of the year to get an update on where we're at with that.
Thank you.
This is Commissioner Klett. Dave, is that effort led by MSO, or is it the MPO that's leading it, or is it a joint effort on that?
Yeah, this is Dave Cronin, city engineer. It is an MPO study. It's being led by the MPO Technical Advisory Committee,
Okay.
which includes members of MSO and MPO and other community that are in the MPO. So,
Okay. Great. Yeah, because I know on our goals for this year was a second meeting with MPO, and that, that may stand as that second, or do you see that as standing it for that second MPO meeting, in terms of getting that input from the land use plan?
Dave Cronin, the engineer. I guess I'm unclear on our goal for meeting with the MPO.
It was a joint meeting, I think, and we had on the goals that we would do that twice a year. We did that once earlier, and I think was that April maybe. So I just didn't know if.
Yeah, we met with the planning commission. So.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Sorry.
So that we did have that on our list of goals for 2 meetings with the planning commission. So we've done one of those. We have not done a second.
Okay. Yeah, we're running out of year, I guess. So get as many of these addressed as we possibly can. But yeah, there's a good lot of work there. All right. Any other questions of Dave about the calendar? The next meeting is October 4th, so we'll be back onto our regular Monday timeframe for the meeting. So can I entertain a motion to adjourn?
It's Commissioner Bryan. I move to adjourn.
All right. Is there a second? Okay, second by Gregory. All in favor, raise your hands. It looks like it's unanimous. All right, thanks everyone.